A world without human rights, without the concept of fairness, where pain and suffering were as common as the rising sun. That was the reality of the Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century. This era is often romanticized with images of knights, castles, and chivalry. But beneath the surface lies a far darker truth, a time of horrifying brutality and inhuman practices that make modern society seem like paradise in comparison. This was an age where justice wasn't served in courts, but often in the town square, with the accused tied to a stake or stretched on a rack. Medicine wasn't based on science, but on superstition, and the sick were more likely to die from their treatments than from their ailments. From public executions to bizarre medical practices, the Middle Ages were a breeding ground for cruelty. The Middle Ages weren't just a dark time for justice. They were also a nightmare for anyone who fell ill or injured. Medicine during this era was less about healing and more about guesswork, superstition, and outright cruelty. Imagine being sick, and instead of receiving proper treatment, a physician drains your blood because they believe your body has too much of it. This was bloodletting, one of the most common medical practices of the Middle Ages. Using knives or leeches, medieval doctors believed they were balancing the 4 humors of the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, the result. Weak, anemic patients who often died, not from their illness, but from the treatment itself. Injured on the battlefield or during daily life, if infection set in, the solution was often amputation. But here's the kicker. There was no anesthesia. You'd be tied down while a surgeon, often more butcher than healer, sawed off the affected limb. If you were lucky, you'd pass out from the pain. If not, you'd endure every agonizing moment while bystanders cheered for the surgeon's speed. The Black Death, a bubonic plague that swept through Europe in the 14th century, claimed the lives of an estimated 25 million people. With no understanding of germs, people turned to superstition for answers. They believed the plague was a punishment from God or caused by miasma, foul-smelling air. Others blamed minority groups, especially Jews, accusing them of poisoning wells. Entire communities were slaughtered in misguided attempts to stop the disease. Treatments for illnesses ranged from bizarre to outright deadly. Suffering from a headache? Physicians might recommend trepanation, drilling a hole into your skull to let out the evil spirits. Got the flu? A poultice of animal dung might be applied to your chest. Yes, you heard that right, dung. The same person who cut your hair might also pull your teeth or perform minor surgeries. These so-called barber surgeons were often the only medical practitioners available in villages. Their tools were crude, their knowledge was limited, and their hygiene was non-existent. Infections were almost guaranteed. The Middle Ages were not only a time of harsh justice and strange medicine, but also an era when entire populations were subjugated under cruel systems of labor and control. Feudalism, the backbone of medieval society, ensured that the rich thrived while the poor toiled endlessly under inhumane conditions. Imagine working from dawn to dusk, breaking your back in fields, and enduring hunger, cold, and disease, only to hand over the majority of your harvest to a lord who viewed you as little more than property. That was the reality for serfs, the lowest class in medieval society. Bound to the land, they had no freedom to leave and no say in their lives. If a feudal lord decided to sell his estate, the serfs were sold with it, like livestock. While serfs weren't technically slaves, their lives were just as oppressive. They were expected to pay taxes, provide military service, and obey their lord's every command. Refusal or resistance often led to brutal punishment. The towering cathedrals and castles that symbolized the Middle Ages came at an unimaginable human cost. Thousands of laborers, many of them serfs, were forced to work under extreme conditions, often for years, without proper tools or safety measures. Injuries and deaths were common, but the lords and clergy cared little as long as the construction continued. Though not as industrialized as later periods, slavery was rampant during the Middle Ages. Enslaved individuals were captured during wars, raids, or sold by their families to settle debts. The Viking raids, for example, often targeted coastal villages to capture slaves who were then sold across Europe. During the Crusades, slavery took on a new dimension. Both Christians and Muslims captured prisoners of war and sold them as slaves. The Church, which condemned the enslavement of Christians, conveniently turned a blind eye when non-Christians were involved. If you thought medieval society was cruel to its own people, its treatment of enemies was even worse. The Middle Ages were an era of constant conflict, and the rules of war were as brutal as the times. Medieval warfare wasn't just about swords and shields. It was about total annihilation. Cities under siege were subjected to starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment. When a city finally fell, its inhabitants, men, women, and children, were often slaughtered en masse. Looting and burning were common practices, leaving survivors to face famine and ruin. Weapons weren't designed to kill swiftly. They were crafted to inflict maximum pain. For instance, spiked maces, flails, and crossbows tore through flesh, leaving soldiers maimed and bleeding out on the battlefield. Conquering armies rarely showed mercy. One infamous example is the sacking of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 941,099. After breaching the city walls, Crusaders massacred tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews, leaving the streets ankle-deep in blood. Similarly, the Mongol invasions in the 13th century brought devastation to Europe and Asia. Entire cities were razed, and their populations were either enslaved or executed to send a chilling message to others. The Crusades, though often romanticized, were rife with atrocities. These holy wars were launched to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, but they quickly devolved into campaigns of greed and brutality. Crusaders didn't just target enemies, they also attacked fellow Christians, looting cities like Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. Religious fervor was often an excuse for unspeakable violence. Anyone who opposed the Crusaders' mission was labeled a heretic or infidel, making their slaughter not just acceptable but divinely sanctioned. Medieval armies frequently used terror to weaken their enemies. Heads of captured soldiers were displayed on spikes, and bodies were mutilated and left in public view. These gruesome tactics were designed to instill fear and force opponents to surrender without a fight. And yet, as barbaric as these practices seem, they're a reminder of humanity's darker instincts that, in some forms, still persist today